Battle of Kohima Close Quarters Combat. War Machiner presents Battle of Kohima Close Quarters Combat. When we talk about the turning points of the Second World War, the list tends to follow a familiar geography: the beaches of Normandy, the frozen rubble of Stalingrad, the coral sand of the Pacific Islands. There is a reason for this. These were the fronts covered by the Western press, filmed by Western cameramen, and written about by Western historians in the immediate aftermath of the war. But if you look at the conflict from a purely strategic perspective, from the viewpoint of terrain, resources, and the disruption of enemy plans, one battle in the hills of northeast India deserves a place alongside those titanic struggles. It is a battle you will rarely see in documentaries, yet in 2013, the National Army Museum in London voted it Britain's greatest battle. It beat out D-Day and Waterloo. The common misconception is that the Battle of Kohima was a siege, a desperate last stand by a beleaguered garrison. That is true, but it is only the surface. The reality that is often overlooked is that Kohima was not just a defensive action, it was a deliberate trap. The Japanese High Command, specifically General Renya Mutaguchi, believed they were marching on Delhi. In reality, General William Slim, commanding the British 14th Army, was using the garrison at Kohima as the bait in a massive pincer movement. The Japanese 31st Division, over 15,000 strong, was marching not into India, but into a killing field of their own making. Understanding Kohima requires us to strip away the myth of the invincible Japanese jungle fighter, and look instead at the cold logistical reality of supply lines, disease, and how close-quarters combat on a single tennis court dictated the fate of a continent. To understand what happened at Kohima, you have to understand the arrogance of the Imperial Japanese Army in 1944. Their early victories had convinced them that the British and Indian soldiers they faced were inferior jungle fighters, lacking the will to endure hardship. This was a fatal misreading of the enemy. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, the 14th Army had undergone a radical transformation under Slim's command. They had been trained not just to fight, but to survive. They were taught that the jungle was not an obstacle, but a friend, a place to hide, to live, and to kill. They learned to treat malaria with discipline, to operate with minimal supplies, and crucially to hold their ground when surrounded. Mutaguchi's plan, Operation Yugo, was a logistical fantasy. He believed his men could live off the land and capture British supplies to sustain their advance. He brought 5,000 oxen with him as mobile rations, but, most died on the brutal march through the Burmese jungle. His soldiers were expected to fight and win in a matter of weeks, before the monsoon turned the trails to mud. Slim, on the other hand, understood that logistics was the currency of modern war. He knew that if he could hold the Japanese in place, the weather and the supply lines would destroy them more effectively than any infantry assault. When the Japanese 31st Division, commanded by the increasingly skeptical General Sato, reached Kohima in early April, they found a garrison of about 2,500 men, a mix of British and Indian troops, along with administrative staff and even cooks, dug in on a ridge that was the seat of the British Deputy Commissioner. The fighting that followed wasn't a battle of maneuver. It was a battle of the Slit Trench. The perimeter shrank rapidly under the relentless Japanese pressure. By the second week, the defenders were crammed into an area on Garrison Hill of roughly 350 square yards. Just to put that into perspective, it's a space smaller than a basketball court. This compression led to a unique form of warfare. Men weren't shooting at shadows in the jungle. They were throwing grenades at voices they could hear whispering in Japanese. One officer of the West Kents calculated that from the moment a Japanese grenade launcher fired to the moment the bomb landed in his trench was just 14 seconds. You didn't have time to think, you only had time to react. The psychological toll of this proximity was immense. Soldiers lived in a state of permanent hypervigilance. The fear was not of a distant enemy, but of waking up to find the occupant of the next trench had been replaced by a Japanese soldier during the night. There's a layer to this story that's almost always ignored in Western accounts, but honestly, it's essential to understanding how the Allies managed to hold on. The Naga people, who lived on those hills, were not just passive observers. The Japanese had conquered Burma by turning the local population against the British, but at Kohima, the opposite happened. the Nagas, many of whom came from tribes with a strong warrior tradition, sided with the British. This wasn't just an accident of politics. It was a matter of relationship. The British Deputy Commissioner, Charles Pawsey, lived among the Nagas and respected their customs. When the Japanese invaded, the Nagas didn't flee. They became the eyes and ears of the garrison. They acted as porters, carrying ammunition and food up the steep slopes under the cover of darkness. They crept through Japanese lines to carry messages and intelligence. They even recovered wounded soldiers who would have otherwise been left to die in the elephant grass. The Japanese, who had expected to be greeted as liberators from colonialism, instead found themselves stalked by headhunters who knew the terrain infinitely better than they did. The Nagas provided the logistical lifeline that Slim had counted on, proving that in irregular warfare, the loyalty of the local population is a force multiplier more valuable than artillery. By mid-May, the battle had stabilized into a brutal stalemate centered on the deputy commissioner's bungalow and its tennis court. The Japanese had dug in on one side of the court, the British on the other. The net was long gone, but the baseline was still visible. Here, the distance between the two most powerful empires in Asia was reduced to the length of a service line. This wasn't maneuver warfare. It was industrial-age slaughter in a pre-industrial setting. The fighting for the tennis court became a lesson in the limits of the Japanese defensive doctrine. The Japanese were masters of the concealed bunker, but they were static. The British, learning from their earlier defeats, adapted. They didn't just throw infantry at the bunkers. The Royal Engineers carved a path through the hillside, a feat of engineering under fire, to drag a Lee Grant tank up the slope. The tank was winched into place on the baseline of the tennis court. From there, at a range of less than 20 yards, it fired solid shot directly into the bunker slits. It was a micro-level example of a macro-level truth. The Japanese reliance on spirit and concealment just couldn't withstand the combination of mechanical power and tactical flexibility. Sato eventually ordered a retreat at the end of May. It was an act of insubordination that saved the remnants of his division, but it signaled the collapse of the Japanese invasion. Of the 85,000 Japanese troops who had crossed the Chindwin, only about 20,000 survived. The vast majority weren't killed by bullets, but by starvation, disease, and exhaustion. They had starved because their supply lines, stretched over mountains and hammered by Allied air power, simply ceased to exist. The lesson of Kohima is a harsh one for any student of survival or military doctrine. It demonstrates that willpower, no matter how fierce, cannot overcome the tyranny of geography and logistics. The Japanese soldiers fought with a bravery that awed their enemies, but they lost because their commanders ignored the math. They ran out of food, water, and ammunition while the Allies, supplied by air and supported by the local population, did not. Kohima proves that in a protracted engagement, the side that can feed its men and treat its wounded will eventually defeat the side that relies on sacrifice alone. It also reminds us that history often overlooks the battles that don't fit the narrative. The men buried on that hill, under the epitaph, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today," secured India and broke the back of the Japanese army in Burma. Their fight on a tennis court in the clouds was as decisive as any fought on the beaches of France. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis that goes beyond the surface-level facts, make sure to subscribe to Warma-een. Hit that like button and share this video with anyone who understands that the real lessons of war are found in the details others skip over.